I'm happy to be back at Southwest Wings for the 30th Southwest Wings and look forward very much to being at one of the next Southwest Wings events in person for a change. It's been a couple of years and I miss it very much. Thank you for letting me talk about books today. Birds and books and birds go together, and they always have. If you think about it, the way that we even say the phrase bird book suggests that it's a single word, not bird book, but bird book. And if we think about what non-birders think about birders, they tend to think about us in terms of our books. They know our books perhaps better than they know some of us. Many of them know, for example, that the most expensive printed book in history is Audubon's Birds of America, published in England in the 1820s and early 1830s. The latest copies of that book to have gone on the market have gone for between $8 and $12 million. And that is a figure that impresses birders and non-birders alike. Nowadays, 200 years after Audubon's day, bird books are being published at a greater rate than ever before. Half a century ago, American birders used to be in awe at the fact that in England, a new bird book appeared at the dizzying pace of every 2 weeks or so. Nowadays, it feels more like every 2 hours or so. I think that's an exaggeration, but there are lots and lots of bird books appearing all the time, making it harder and harder for those of us who like birds and like bird books to figure out what we need and what we want, what the difference is between needing and wanting, and how to change our wants into our needs. It's difficult to decide in advance. Some of the online opportunities that are available now are very good. The Look Inside feature at Amazon, for example, can give you a fairly good glimpse of what the inside of a book looks like. There are also online catalogs of the various booksellers that at least show you the covers and sometimes have a little bit of description of the book's content. The best way, though, is still the old way. The best way is to talk to your friends and the people that you meet in the field. Ask them what they're reading, what they're using, and what they like and what they don't like about their favorite books. Or alternatively, you can ask them about some of their regretted purchases. Birders like to talk about their books when there aren't a lot of birds to watch. Sometimes, if you're lucky, your friends will even let you borrow their books to look at. And sometimes those books even find their way back to their real owners. Talking to your friends. This afternoon, let me be that friend for just a little while. And since we're on Zoom, I don't have to worry about getting any of my books back. What I want to concentrate today on is the works that I think make up a basic Arizona birder's library. Whether that library is an old-fashioned one with shelves, or it's a digital library that you carry around with you on your cell phone. Or like most of us, if your library is a mix of printed paper books and digital books. Beginning birders are often told that the only two things that they need are binoculars and a field guide. You can do without the binoculars. You can learn to get up close to birds and learn to identify them without classic uptight views. But a field guide is perhaps essential. When I was a young birder, way more than 40 years ago, we had only two choices when it came to field guides. We had the Roger Tory Peterson field guides. For those of us in the East, we had the 1947 edition of the Peterson Field Guide to the Birds. For those of us who lived west of the 100th meridian, we had Roger Tory Peterson's 1962 edition of the Western Bird Guide. That was our choice on the one hand. On the other hand, we had Chandler Robbins's Golden Guide, published in 1966, which made it quite up to date in my day. Now, both of these choices, Peterson on the one hand and the Golden Guide on the other, had advantages and disadvantages. The Peterson's Guide major disadvantage was that the plates were stuck in the middle of the book. They did not face the species accounts, but they were gathered into a section at the center of the book. This, of course, was a result of simple publishing economics. Paintings and photographs have to be printed on glossy paper. Glossy paper is expensive and heavy, and so it makes better sense, or it made better sense 60 years ago, to print those as a separate section in the book. The Golden Guide, which first appeared in 1966, really excited people because those plates, the illustrations, faced the text. And that was a great advantage. Unfortunately, not all of the paintings in the Golden Guide really looked all that much like birds. All the same, though, the Golden Guide really came to dominate the birding market in the 1960s and especially in the 1970s. It was so popular a book and so well-known a book that in the late 1970s, another book called Birds for Real was published to criticize the Golden Guide, essentially a book-length book review of the Golden Guide. Nowadays, we're much, much better off. The Golden Guide and the Peterson Guides have both been continually republished in new editions, but the Golden Guide and the Peterson Guide are increasingly thought of as beginner's books. Indeed, over the past few decades, Houghton Mifflin, the publisher of the Peterson Guides, seems to have identified in beginning birders a very powerful market segment, a discrete market, and they've been pitching the newest editions of the Peterson Bird Guides to beginners. Now, the latest, the 2020 version of the Peterson Field Guide to the Birds is really very good, and not only beginners, but birders at all levels of experience can profit from that book. Some of the new paintings are really quite superior. All the same, though, that is not the first choice that I would offer a Martian birder visiting the Tucson area. So what options do we have today? We have two options, and most of you will know what we have. We have the National Geographic Field Guide to the Birds, now in its 7th edition, and we have the Sibley Guide. These are really the two books that nowadays birders with ambition and birders who are quite active in the field tend to use. How to choose between them? Well, you really can't go all that wrong with either one. For a long time, though, I was a staunch supporter of the National Geographic whenever it came to using a bird book in Arizona. Now, however, the new 2nd edition of the Sibley Guide, which is only about 5 years old now, has really caught up to National Geographic in ways that, to my mind, make Sibley in Arizona a co-first choice rather than a close runner-up. Let's talk about the National Geographic Guide for just a minute. It first appeared in 1983, and it was the product of a large team of artists and writers organized and edited by Claudia Wilds. Now, a large team of artists and writers sounds like a very good thing if you think about the sum total of experience and perspectives that those people bring to a bird book. Unfortunately, a large team of writers and artists also means that there was a fair bit of inconsistency in the content, in the approach, and even in the quality of the books included in the book. Nevertheless, the National Geographic Guide in 1983 was immediately recognized as eons ahead of Peterson or the Golden Guide. Now, it took a while for it to trickle down, as it were, into the broader birding community because the National Geographic Guide was very expensive when it first came out, and for a long time, it was available only by mail order from the National Geographic Society. For a couple of years, it felt a bit like a status symbol among birders if you said that you had been reading the National Geographic Guide, especially though once it appeared in the bookstores and was more widely available there, it became the book that everyone referred to for anything having to do with the identification of birds in North America, north of Mexico. As I said, it's gone through 7 editions since then, and it has improved with each edition, which isn't always the case with a book of any kind, and certainly not always the case with a bird book. What has happened over the course of those 7 editions is that that original large, diverse team has been whittled down to 2 extraordinarily capable writers and artists, John Dunn, who is responsible for the text in the latest editions, and Jonathan Alderfer, who is the art editor and the artist of many of the plates in the newer editions. The text of the latest edition of the National Geographic Guide by John Donne is a marvel. It is thorough, it is precise, it is well written. It has never been bettered. The paintings too have evolved over the years. Jonathan Alderfer has been in charge of the artwork for the National Geographic Guide, and he has painted some of the plates anew himself, and others he has commissioned other artists to replace some of the less pleasing and less informative images. The Gray Vireo, for example, when the first edition of the National Geographic Guide came out in 1983, I could not see how anyone could identify a gray vireo using that book. And that bird has been repainted in the 7th edition. In fact, you've got a very good chance at identifying a gray vireo if you're out where gray vireos occur. If you really want to see, though, how this book has evolved, grab the first edition, the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th, or any selection of those, and trace the treatment of the dowitchers, the long-billed and short-billed dowitchers, or trace the treatment of the vesper sparrow through the editions that you have at hand. You'll see that the text and the paintings change each and every time a new edition comes out, and each and every time they got better. So hats off to the National Geographic Guide, still one of my favorite bird books of all time. The great advantage of the National Geographic Guide for the Arizona birder is its coverage. We have to remember what North America means in the title of a field guide. It means North America, the United States and Canada, north of Mexico. Now in Arizona and elsewhere, birds don't respect those political borders. They stray across those political borders. And I remember in the 1970s, birders coming back and regaling us with tales of Berlin hummingbirds and five-striped sparrows that they'd seen in Arizona. And we had no idea what they were talking about. Those birds were not in the books back then. Under John Donne's tutelage, though, the National Geographic Guide has made it a rule to include every bird recorded from the book's area of coverage, so that if you find a bird that's not in the National Geographic Guide, you know you've come up with something very, very good. And that's why I recommend it to those birding the edges of the US and Canada. If you're in Newfoundland or in Florida or in Alaska or in Texas or in California or in Arizona, you want your field guide to offer you as many species as possible, no matter how rare or infrequent they may be. Another big advantage to Arizona birders in using the National Geographic Guide is John Donne's interest in geographic variation. Now, before 1962, most North American bird books included subspecies in their treatments of the birds, not just species, but the identifiable geographic populations of those species. Peterson, though, in 1961-62, writing in the 2nd edition of his Western Guide, he announced to us that subspecies do not concern the field observer, and he told us we should forget about subspecies. This was new. But as the forces of taxonomic change marched on, birders took Peterson to heart, and they stopped looking closely at juncos. We stopped looking closely at red-tailed hawks. We stopped looking closely at Bell's vireos, and the other bird books followed Peterson in that. National Geographic, however, has always been at pains to illustrate and describe the range of differences observable in species with wide geographic distributions. And it's largely thanks to the National Geographic Guide and its development over the course of its 7 editions that new birders are no longer as confused by the drab Bell's vireos of Southeast Arizona, or the pale rusty song sparrows, or the grayish yellow warblers. Suddenly, as a matter of geographic variation, it made sense, and those birds could be identified. The Sibley Guide by David Sibley first appeared in the year 2000, right at the turn of this century, and it was and is very different from the National Geographic Guide. It has very little text, very little prose at all. It is focused very tightly on identification without the same breadth of treatment, including habits, habitat, that sort of thing that the National Geographic Guide provides in such abundance. There was also no effort made to make the paintings in the Sibley Guide attractive. or to place the birds in their habitats. They were tiny images, all of them in the same pose, facing the same way, really quite cartoon-like, caricature-like, and the most informative, the best, the most instructive paintings ever prepared for a field guide. Mostly, it's the design of the page that made the Sibley Guide the huge hit that it is, and it's many birders' favorite. By doing without much prose, and by keeping the images of the birds quite small, it was possible to line all the birds up on a single opening so that the eye can make immediate direct comparisons without having to shift from one register of the page to another, without compensating for differences in posture and background. This will be quite familiar to all of you. I will open the book at random to a page of terns, and I believe you can see that the terns are all lined up in the same way, and all that you have to do is scan from left to right or right to left, and you can immediately compare the 2 or 4 species on the opening. Now that design and the small size of the images and the relative scarcity of the text made the book look very sparse when we first opened it 21 years ago. But never was a bird book so generous in anticipating the reader's needs and tendencies. It was a hugely improved ease of reading, ease of use that made the Sibley Guide the hit that it is. The hit that it is for Eastern readers, at least. The New Englander, David Sibley, knew and knows his Western birds. There's no question about that. But the easy familiarity and the outstanding comprehensiveness with which he treated the Eastern birds in the 2000 edition of the Sibley Guide, it seemed to sometimes fall just a little bit short when it was applied in the accounts of their Western counterparts. And most important for the Arizona birder, in geographic coverage, Sibley represented a bit of a step back from the National Geographic. It excluded most of the mega rarities that we're always looking for, especially in places like Arizona. Much of that changed with the second edition of the Sibley Guide in 2016. There was a small loss in the clarity of the design, the addition of new species, the expansion of the text to include, most notably, discussions of habitat. Those additions made it impossible to carry through with all the visual comparisons as the first edition had set up for us. But all those new birds and the new text, of course, meant even more information for birders, and birders live on information. And the coverage of the strays at the edge of the ABA area is now nearly as good in the Sibley Guide as it is in the National Geographic. And in some cases, it's better. Let's look quickly at the examples of the brown-backed solitaire, a very fine rarity in Southeast Arizona. The solitaire has been included in a couple of the latest editions of the National Geographic, but it's in an appendix. This is the appendix in the back of the book. It's separated by 150 pages from its closest relative, the Townsend solitaire. It gets a single illustration, a very good illustration by Jonathan Alderfer, and there's a lot of precise range information in just that tiny, tiny paragraph. We get the precise dates, for example, of the Arizona records of this West Mexican specialty, and we get a nice description of the incredible song. Now that bird was absent entirely from the first edition of the Sibley Guide, but look at what happened to it in the second edition. The brown-backed solitaire is fully integrated into the main body of the book. It's placed on the same page with the Townsend solitaire for direct and immediate comparison. There's a distribution map that complements the somewhat general description in words of the geographic distribution. And there are 3 full-size paintings with annotations, including 2 showing the bird in flight. That's a lot of information for a bird that has only occurred, what, a half dozen times in the ABA area. A couple of pages farther on, the book gets even more exotic, as it were. This opening combines the rufous-backed robin, the clay-colored and white-throated thrush, and the orange-billed nightingale thrush. Now, this section of the book is made as if to inspire Arizona birders. So I hope that someone will get out there and discover a nightingale thrush in Arizona now. So as you see, the choice between National Geographic and the Sibley Guide for use in Arizona isn't easy anymore. Myself, I find lately that if I am hoping just to remind myself of the distinguishing field marks, say which of the big hummingbirds, the blue-throated mountain gem or the Rivoli hummingbird, which of them has the big tail spots and which of them has the small tail spots, I'm likely to just reach for the Sibley Guide. But if I want to refresh my memory more generally about a species, I'll take the National Geographic off the shelf and read that more extensive text. But one thing is for sure now, either the National Geographic or the Sibley Guide will work for you in Southeast Arizona. And that is something that I would not have said just 5 years ago. Both of those titles, the National Geographic Guide and the Sibley Guide, are illustrated by paintings, just as Peterson and the Golden Guide were illustrated by paintings beginning in the middle of the last century. But what about photographs? Photographic field guides, believe it or not, have been around since the end of the 19th century, and they've never been very successful. It was hard to get good photographs of all the birds and hard to reproduce those photographs. Now, publishing advances, printing advances, and the abundance of very high quality digital images of almost every single bird in the world, and certainly every bird that occurs in Arizona, mean that photographic guides are a real option for birders nowadays. For whatever reason, most photo guides have been pitched to beginners, but there is one that stands out for birders of every level of experience, and that is the Stokes Field Guide to the Birds of North America. This is a brick. It's a big book. It's bigger than National Geographic, heavier than Sibley. It has excellent photographs. It has accessible but very sophisticated text. It has good species coverage. This book has photographs of the brown shrike and the oriental cuckoo, not, however, of the brownback solitaire. There's some attention given to geographic variation. It's not immune, of course, to the challenges of working with photographs. Take the example from a second ago of the tail spots of the large hummingbirds in Southeast Arizona. It's impossible to get them posed in exactly the same way at exactly the same angle so that you can see exactly the same excerpt of the tail. Now, perhaps surprisingly, the most influential guide, and one that is increasingly used by young birders and ambitious birders, is a guide that has no color pictures at all. It has no paintings, it has no photographs. This is Peter Pyle's Identification Guide to North American Birds. It comes in 2 volumes, in case the other books aren't heavy enough for you, 1,500 pages. And it has scattered line drawings of parts of birds. Now, its focus is less on species identification than on the aging and sexing and the geographic variation of birds, with a focus on molt patterns and feather conditions. But it does have species identification material, and you never know just what you'll find to help yourself in the field if you just browse through the accounts every once in a while. For example, the nighthawks. Birders new to Arizona sometimes have trouble distinguishing between the lesser and the common nighthawk, and they are quite challenging. But molt timing distinguishes them immediately this time of year. Lesser nighthawks are molting their primaries between June and September. Common nighthawks don't molt for the most part until they reach the wintering grounds in South America. So if right now you go outside and you see a nighthawk overhead with symmetrical gaps in the wing, it's a lesser nighthawk. The common nighthawks are not molting yet. Raven identification, which is perhaps the most challenging identification problem in Arizona. Common ravens, we find, molt beginning in June, and Chihuahuan ravens start their wing molt in September. So if you see a raven molting in June, July, or early August, it's a common. If you see one molting quite late in the summer into the early fall, it's a Chihuahuan raven. That kind of information is scattered throughout the Pyle Guide, packed into very concise phrases. This is not an easy book to use. It's not a book to read. But if you get in the habit of excavating the species accounts a couple at a time. Whenever you see a new bird or whenever you see a plumage feature that you don't quite recognize or that surprises you, look through the accounts and you'll come up with some surprises that'll help you in the field. And of course, this is the book that you want if you happen to run across a dead bird that you can examine up close in detail. If I remember right, the Pile ID guide, all 1,500 pages of it, was on Ted Floyd's list of things changing birding in the 21st century. And I couldn't agree more. It is a revolutionary work. It's a bit of a slog to read through, but revolutionary. There are two other much more user-friendly books that focus on just a selection of the more challenging identifications among North American birds. Both will help you identify, both will help you solve specific field problems, but more importantly and more generally, both of them teach you techniques that you can apply to other species as well. Ken Kaufman's Advanced Birding, which has now appeared in 2 editions, the second edition with this very fancy warbler on the cover. It's poorly named. It's called Advanced Birding, but in fact, it's for birders with all levels of experience. And it is a teaching text. It takes difficult species pairs or trios or sometimes larger groups of species as teaching examples to expand the discussion beyond what any traditional field guide has room for. Now, because much of Ken Kaufman's formative time as a birder was spent in Arizona, the chapters or lessons, as I tend to think of them, they're particularly relevant to those of us lucky enough to be birding the Southwest. There are chapters devoted to thrashers, to winter sparrows, to the small hummingbirds, to hawks, to flycatchers, and so on. All of those groups that pose identification problems to all of us at one time or another. And Advanced Birding is full of concrete tips that exemplify an approach to birding beyond anything that the standard field guide covering an entire continent can tell us. The second edition of the book is, as you can see just by measuring the width of the spines, the second edition is much more expensive than the first. It's illustrated, though, with manipulated digital photographs, which give me the creeps. And so in general, I'm more likely to consult the first edition, which has Ken Kaufman's own simple but very informative line drawings scattered through the text. Another one that is not, for some reason, on everyone's bookshelf is Kevin Zimmer's unfairly neglected Western Bird Watcher, which was retitled in its second edition, Birding in the American West. Both editions focus on identification challenges. The second edition has 200 absolutely packed but absolutely readable pages dealing with difficult species pairs. I'd been birding for the better part of a decade when the first edition, Western Birdwatcher, came out, but honestly, I'll admit, that is the book that finally taught me my sparrows after 10 years of dealing with the normal field guides. And when we used to take birding vacations in Arizona, that is often what I would pack to take with me. I wouldn't take a traditional field guide, but I would take Zimmer's Birding in the American West, a series of thoughtful, really quite informative essays about exactly the problem IDs that I was expecting to run into in the deserts and the canyons. And still today, I'm shocked when I scan a birder friend's bookshelves and the book is not there. Now, the second edition of Zimmer's Birding in the American West styles itself a handbook. And indeed, it does cover more than just difficult species identifications. It has good in-depth discussions of the habitats of the American West. It offers advice about general birding techniques and strategies. And it even offers a finding guide, giving you a hint about where you can find some of the scarcer or more desirable species in the Western US and Canada. And that, of course, is the next thing that most birders want. Once we've seen the pictures of the birds that we want to see, where do we go to see the real thing? Birding in the American West is sometimes very specific about that, but a more tightly focused regional field guide is likely to help us much more as we make our way through hotspots, famous hotspots and little-known hotspots. And Arizona has been lucky for well more than 50 years. There's an abundance of such resources now for much of the state. But Southeast Arizona especially has profited from the finding guides. In fact, the first of the Lane bird finding guides was published for Southeast Arizona in 1966, and it's gone through a number of editions since then. This is the latest, with a very nice, elegant trogon on the cover, prepared by Rick Taylor. The other is Tucson Audubon's Finding Birds in Southeast Arizona, updated again and again. The ABA guide, the Lane guide, will probably not be updated in print again. Now, both of these books, the TAS guide and the ABA guide, have great merits for our area, but I would say on the whole that the Tucson Audubon guide, Finding Birds in Southeast Arizona, is better. It has more sites, there's more detail about each of those sites, and there's more information about common birds. And it's important to remember that birders making their first outing or their first 10 outings in Southeast Arizona, while obviously they'd be dazzled to find a great rarity, are also going to be very excited about the more common species, the more familiar species. I several times had people come to Southeast Arizona and tell me the bird they most wanted to see was the Gila woodpecker or the verdin. The American Birding Association Birders Guide to Southeast Arizona won't much help you with that, but the Tucson Audubon Society guide will send you places where you are likely to run across a good selection of exactly those desert specialties that people are wanting to see, whether they're common or rare. The Tucson Audubon Guide also offers updates online, which makes it the up-to-the-minute resource for finding birds in Southeast Arizona. Now, speaking of online, this is probably, the bird finding guide is probably the one genre of bird books that is doomed to extinction in print. I like reading them just for recreation, dreaming of new places and new birds, so I like them in paper, but constant updating is impossible for a printed book. It needs to be done online. And if you have to have paper, you can always print an excerpt from a web page. Arizona has some very fine online books, as it were. Tommy DeBartleben's Birder from Maricopa, which many of you know and use, does a splendid job for central and north central Arizona. The Arizona Field Ornithologist's website has a page devoted to little known birding areas in Arizona, and new entries are offered there. One source that many people don't think of when they think of finding a specific species of bird is eBird. It's quite easy to rummage around in eBird, to search for a species map, and to create de facto bird finding guides of your own that you can just put on your cell phone. If you're looking, for example, for a zone-tailed hawk, you can go to eBird, you can discover where zone-tailed hawks have been seen in the last day or the last week or the last month. Each of those sites on eBird links to maps and directions to the site, works very, very well. So Arizona's birds. It's very hard to find a comprehensive whole landscape overview of the avifauna of Arizona. Sadly, in the 1870s, Elliott Cowes burned all 3,000 pages of his draft of an Arizona bird book. And we had to wait until 1951 when Herbert Brandt published his Arizona and Its Bird Life, a really delightful book, a big book. It's full of discursive essays about his experiences with Arizona birds, how Arizona birds relate to their habitats, how elevation works. The book is long out of print, but most public library branches in Arizona have a copy or can get you a copy of Herbert Brandt's Arizona and Its Bird Life. Still an authoritative source for Arizona is Alan Phillips's Birds of Arizona, which appeared in 1964. It's still essential. It's called Alan Phillips's Birds of Arizona, but it was in fact assembled from Phillips's notes and drafts by some of his colleagues and friends. Any book associated with Alan Phillips is going to be idiosyncratic in some ways. And this book is idiosyncratic in a couple of ways. It's idiosyncratic in its taxonomy. It lumps the lazuli and indigo buntings, for example. It lumps the Nashville and the Virginia's warblers. I believe that it lumps the black-headed and rose-breasted grosbeaks too. It's also unique in its treatment of the status of some of Arizona's birds. The purplish-backed jay, for example, is treated as a genuine vagrant, when obviously every purplish-backed jay ever seen in the state of Arizona came across the border in a cage. Now, the book is more than 60 years old, or almost 60 years old, 1964, but it remains the basis for evaluating the change in the status and distribution of a bird in Arizona. And the great thing, this is a very cheap book. Just about any used bookstore in Arizona has copies, and they don't charge very much for them. It's a great value for money, as it were. Now, the book has not been updated in its full illustrated format, but there is a tiny little paperback that represents an updating of the text of the 1964 Birds of Arizona. The most recent edition, so far as I know, appeared in 1980, which is 42 years ago. Oddly, this little pocket volume is much harder to find than the big book, but well worth looking for. And to give you a sense of just how thirsty Arizona birders are for comprehensive treatments of the state's avifauna, the back of this volume says, "Arizona birders rejoice" at the appearance of this little paperback updating the 1964 Birds of Arizona. Now, we do have a very good overview of the breeding birds of Arizona. The Arizona Breeding Bird Atlas, edited by Troy Corman and Catherine Wise Gervais. It's a great overview, one that belongs on every Arizona birder shelf, but it has seasonal limitations, obviously. It's a breeding bird atlas, so it's much less informative about the birds of winter, for example. It's now pushing 20 years old. It appeared in 2005 based on fieldwork conducted between 1993 and 2000. And so there is naturally some lack of up-to-dateness in some of the accounts. But it represents a tremendous effort and a tremendous accomplishment. The editors worked with data collected by over 700 atlas workers, and those 700 atlas workers covered more than 1/6 of the land area of Arizona, a tremendous achievement. The book has maps and prose accounts of every species known at the time to breed in Arizona, but it also has a very good introduction to Arizona habitats, which certainly helped me, a boy of the Midwest, when I moved to Arizona. The species accounts feature photographs of the species, and there are large, easily interpreted maps. Most important, even though the book was contributed to by 19 different authors, each of the accounts is very consistently structured. So it's easy to scan for specific types of information about, say, timing or the materials of nest construction or the behavior of nesting birds. Now, as the title suggests, that book covers only those species that are known or suspected to have bred in Arizona. But even outside of the breeding season, the materials that I just mentioned will be very helpful for birders, whether you're a local or a visitor. There are also some sub-regional works for Arizona, and one that I particularly like is Ken Rosenberg's Birds of the Lower Colorado River. Over in the same area, Henry Detweiler has published a bird finding guide for Yuma. And between those two, birders out in the badly underbirded southwestern part of Arizona have some very good resources. Now, say that you're fairly familiar with your birds, and you have developed a special interest in one group or another, say a family of birds or an order of birds. Some of the best and most relevant of the specialty guides for Arizona birders are also some of the best for any groups. Hummingbirds, of course, are a challenge to many of us. There's a vast hummingbird literature, a good 80% of it, I would say, coffee table books and other picture books. But there are two works that I would recommend wholeheartedly to Arizona birders and to birders actually anywhere in the US and Canada, given the way that hummingbirds roam. We have the Peterson Field Guide to Hummingbirds of North America by Sherry Williamson in its first edition. And we have Steve Howell's Hummingbirds of North America, the photographic guide published by Princeton University Press. The Peterson guide has lots of advantages. It's by a local author, as you may know, and so it has a lot of very precise local information for Arizona. It's well written and there's a lot of information in it. Unfortunately, it was very poorly designed and very hard to use. The pictures are tiny. The text is sort of scattered all over the page. Houghton Mifflin did a disservice when it published this book, but as I understand it, there is a second edition in progress, and I'm sure that all of those design problems will be cleared up so that the physical and graphical appearance of the book does justice to its really fine content. Now, the Princeton Guide by Steve Howell is one of my favorite bird books ever. It too is something like 20 years old, but it features big photographs. It's got a generous, logical layout. It's clearly written as one would expect from Steve Howell. It's really a fine, fine book. And in a way, the Princeton Guide, Hummingbirds of North America, falls between the treatment of the hummingbirds in a standard field guide and the treatment of hummingbirds in Pile. Remember the 1,500 pages of identification guide. The Steve Howell Hummingbird book teaches you to apply traditional in-hand characters in the field. And hummingbirds are especially good for this approach because many of them are easily watched and they're easily photographed at feeders and flowers. And if you have a good photograph of a hummingbird, and thanks to advances in digital cameras, many people do, you can see things like the feather shape of the wings and the tail. You can see the pattern of the tail feathers. You can, with extremely good photographs, use old in-hand characters on things like Allen's and Rufus hummingbirds photographed in the field. Steve Howell's book also is very good at helping you get your eye in to using molt, again, the loss and replacement of feathers in hummingbird identification. Anna's and Costa's hummingbirds, for example, if I remember right, are molting their wing feathers right now, while black-chinned hummingbirds are not. And so if you come up with a troublesome, a difficult female of one of those species, you can rule out one or the other based on the molt status of the wing. Another group of birds that have had lots of titles dedicated to them are the hawks, the falcons, the eagles, the kites. In general, I would say that the standard field guides work well here for identification of the raptors, especially the second edition of the Big Sibley. But if you want to know more about their identification and especially about their behavior and habits, there's a very fine book dedicated to Arizona's raptors called, unsurprisingly, The Raptors of Arizona, edited by Richard Glinsky. A very, very helpful book if you're interested in exactly what are the conditions and circumstances of life as a raptor in Arizona. As a more general approach to hawk identification, I still very much like a title that many of you may know, Hawks in Flight by Pete Dunn and David Sibley. This book, because of its authorship, is strongly Eastern in its bias, even in this second edition, which includes Western birds, but you can still tell that, that this book was written by Easterners for Easterners. Fortunately, though, this book is more about techniques, more about strategies, more about new ways to look than it is about field marks. And it will change the way that you look at raptors overhead. You won't be necessarily looking at the field marks that you learned in your Peterson guide anymore. You'll be looking at the bird as a whole phenomenon. And even though the focus is on the East rather than the West, this is a really fine example of how reading books about birds other than your own birds can really enrich your time afield. Shorebirds are another group that have a lot of books dedicated to them, and it's a good thing. Unlike the raptors, which are relatively straightforward, the shorebirds can be fairly subtle. Shorebird identification may not be the first thing you think of as a field identification challenge in Arizona, but Southeast Arizona has some of the best opportunities for close-up looks at many of North America's shorebird species. There's so little water, it concentrates them, and you can get close to them. I have two favorites among the shorebird specialty guides. One is the rather presumptuously named The Shorebird Guide by Michael O'Brien and Richard Crossley and Kevin Carlson. And the other, you might think of it as sort of the complete opposite, the Stokes' Beginner's Guide to Shorebirds. Now, the Shorebird Guide is one of the most instructive books around that you can give to new birders, and old birders like me can also benefit from it very well. It's an extremely visual book. It's full of photographs, many very beautiful portraits, very evocative photos of the birds, but it also is full of poor photos of the birds, badly lit, blurry, distant, exactly the way that you tend to see some shorebirds some of the time. And the authors of the book then ask you to move your eye away from field marks to ask yourself what you're actually seeing rather than what you're looking for, what you're looking at rather than what you're seeking. So there's lots of talk about habits, habitats, vocalizations, shape, structure, all the sorts of things that experienced shorebird watchers use without necessarily even knowing it. There's also a very good text about the status and distribution of the shorebirds, but that text is separated from the photographs. It's obvious that the main part of the Shorebird Guide is the photographs, and the text is just in there to fill it out. I often wonder what birding in North America would look like if every group of birds had a guide as good as the Shorebird Guide. Now, the Stokes Beginner's Guide to Shorebirds is just a little tiny thing. It's about the size of a checkbook, and it's poorly named. It's named the Beginner's Guide, probably to sell more of them, but in fact, it's another one of those so-called beginner's books that helps everyone from the beginning birder to the expert birder. It too teaches you how to look. Much of shorebirding is comparative. It's hard to look at a shorebird and say, oh, that's a long bill, or that's a short tarsus. You say, oh, that's a longer bill, or oh, that's a shorter tarsus. And the function of this little book, the Stokes Beginner's Guide to Shorebirds, eases the birder into a comparative mindset. The photos and the brief texts are very good memory joggers for anybody, but it's the introductory material telling you how to look at shorebirds in a new way that makes it such a good book. The warblers, we tend to think of as more of an Eastern problem than an Arizona problem. But remember, lots of so-called Eastern warblers occur as regular vagrants in the West, all the way to the Pacific, in fact, in California. There are a few specialty guides to the warblers out there, and I can't say that I'm particularly enamored of any of them. The newest one is called The Warbler Guide, taking its cue from The Shorebird Guide. Greatly heralded book, huge numbers of photographs, and lots of sonograms. The book has a very salutary focus on vocalizations in the identification of warblers. I'll come to better terms with this book someday, but it does have a couple of very important contributions to make. One is, as I just said, the focus on vocalizations. One learns that each warbler has not just the one song that is transcribed in the old field guides, but that most warbler species have a number of different songs that need to be learned. The book also treats the chip notes of the warblers, which are very hard to capture in a book. Best of all, though, among the many tiny photos are photos of just parts of the bird. And if you've ever spent a May morning on a good warbler day in the East, you know that parts of the bird is often what you see. It's hard sometimes, especially once those leaves have come out in May, to get a classic field guide profile view of a wood warbler. What you get instead is a flash of color here, a wingtip there, a bill there, a side of the tail there. And the Warbler Guide shows you how to start with those glimpses, with those partial views of the bird, create a search image in your mind that allows you to fill in the gaps and identify the bird so that you know exactly what you're looking for when it does pop out into view. Very helpful. Far more traditional is the Peterson Field Guide to Warblers by John Dunn and Kimball Garrett. It's a much more traditional book in layout and approach. It's illustrated with both photographs and paintings, which I find very, very useful. and it has lots of detail. This is the book that you go to if you've got a very fine photograph of a mystifying warbler, or if you've got a very good look at a mystifying warbler. All of the details are there. And that sort of thoroughness, that sort of comprehensiveness in the species accounts can inspire you to notice in the field things that you just might have overlooked otherwise. And those details can sometimes clinch a challenging identification. All that said, I'll admit that I don't often find it necessary to go beyond the standard field guides to identify warblers, but certainly having at hand the Peterson Field Guide to Warblers and Tom Stevenson and Scott Whittle's Warbler Guide will certainly help you prepare and will certainly help you solve some of the mysteries. The sparrows, it's hard to imagine that there are lots of books that have been written about the identification of the North American sparrows. In fact, the earliest of the specialty guides to a family of birds was Sparrows and Finches, written in the 1890s by Charles Johnson Maynard and directed at school children. Now, just what Maynard was thinking when he decided to introduce children to bird watching by getting them to go out and identify sparrows, I'm not sure, but I certainly admire his guts in starting out that way. My favorite among all the sparrow guides out there, the one that I still reach for on my own shelf, is Jim Rising and David Beadle's Guide to the Identification and Natural History of Sparrows. It's a very straightforward book, illustrated with paintings. It lays out the identification material very neatly, very clearly, and it also offers for each of the species a more comprehensive, extensive review of the ecology and behavior of all of our sparrows, towies, juncos, lark buntings. It's a pleasure to look at this book, and it's a pleasure to read. Now, the same author team a few years later published a photographic guide with Princeton University Press to the sparrows of the United States and Canada. And that book is really not an improvement at all over the Guide to the Identification and Natural History. It's a bit of a mess from the design perspective, which is a shame. But The Sparrows of the United States and Canada by Jim Rising and David Beadle is a book that every sparrow fan should have. And if you're not a sparrow fan, get the book and then you will be a sparrow fan. Now, most sparrows nowadays are pretty straightforward with the standard field guides. There are some exceptions, of course. The juvenile Melospiza sparrows, Song and Swamp and Lincolns, the old sage sparrows, sagebrush and bell sparrows, the old brewer sparrows, brewer sparrow and timberline sparrow. Those are difficult, and a specialty guide will help you. If you want to go beyond the standard field guides, if you've encountered a challenge that the standard field guides don't help you solve, I would go back to Kevin Zimmer's Western Birdwatcher and Birdwatching in the American West, the second edition. And that book is especially good in the Southwest for challenges like the Bottery sparrow, the Baird sparrow, and so on. Now, let's say that at this point, having read through and memorized all of these books, you know your birds well enough at the identification level. And you ask yourself one day, what makes a bird a bird? And this is the last book that I think I'll point out as useful. This is Frank Gill and Rick Crumb's fourth edition of Ornithology. It's a college textbook, but it's clearly written, beautifully illustrated, and the sort of thing that any birder with an interest beyond identification wants to read. I use it as a reference tool. If somebody asks me something about the circulatory system of a bird, I have no idea, so I take it off the shelf and am able to answer that question that way. Then I read the rest of the chapter because it's so well written and so captivating. And then I take the little quiz at the end of the chapter to see if I've actually learned anything. And if I do well on the quiz, I feel very good. And that is really the purpose of birding, isn't it? To feel really good. And the purpose of the bird books that surround us, that sit on our shelves, that fill our minds, that we talk about with our friends, The purpose of those books is to increase the feeling good of birding. It's to increase the pleasure of birding by increasing the knowledge that we have available and the materials that we have to think about birds with. I want to thank you very much for coming this afternoon, for letting me talk about some of my favorite bird books for Southeast Arizona. I hope that you will look at your own shelves with a new eye now, and perhaps that I've mentioned a title or two that you may want to check out from the library or purchase. In any event, again, thank you very much for coming, and I very much hope to get to see you at one of the next installments of Southwest Wings, this time in person. Bye now.